You spent 6 years in the Middle East, so having become a Muslim in your East Anglian stronghold, you travelled to Turkey, you went to the Balkans, I think you were in Egypt at some one time. So you were looking at not just Sufism, which in the West is regarded as the most congenial, perhaps, form of Islam in many circles. You began to see other kinds of Islam. You began to be familiar with Wahhabism, were you?
Yeah, I mean, my conversion had been really a very private, rather strange thing. I didn't actually meet any practicing Muslims until I went along for the conversion ceremony. So then it was obvious at some point I'd have to see the reality. And the first thing I did was to go to Morocco. And my first experience in Morocco was I was with a school friend. And we looked at the map and found a small place where we decided to spend the night. The bus put us off. There was no place there except for a tea house and a whole load of pine trees, and it was midnight. And these Moroccans drove up in a pickup truck and pushed us on the back of the pickup truck, without a word, took us off into the mountains. Later I realised they thought we were the usual ragamuffin Westerners looking for hashish, so they could cut a good deal with us. So the next morning I woke up, this beautiful valley, and there was only one crop being cultivated, and the light of the sun, and it was wonderful. That was kind of shocking to my sort of neophyte, puritanical, idealistic idea about the Islamic world. The most shocking thing was, in the middle of this valley, obviously with the proceeds, they built themselves a beautiful little mosque. So that was quite a good lesson for me, really, even though I was shocked at the time, because it taught me that I was going to have to deal with the reality, which is that theory and practice in Muslim communities have a complicated relationship with each other.
Now, you're growing up and into a new culture. What do you make of the attitude to women within the Islam that you embraced?
I'd experienced British public schools when there were no women, and we had heard vague rumours of their existence. And then, while I was at school, they appeared in all of their sort of peacock finery, and we were duly amazed, and the culture changed overnight. But I was always quite comfortable with a world in which there was immense mutual respect, but where there was a certain separation as well. One of the great things for me worshipping in mosques was that distraction, charming though it was actually no longer there, because the women are way out of sight in another part of the building. That was my main experience of gender issues in Islam as I joined up.
But also the evaluation of women within judgmental legal system and so on is to make a woman a less valuable person than a man in courts of law and things like that.
That's not the way most Muslim women will put it. The reality is that at the moment in England, probably a majority of converts are actually women. Women do seem to really enjoy the religion and flourish within it.
Nonetheless, it's at the crux very often of the disagreement between the West, if we're going to speak in those terms, the West and the East, that the democratic countries will say Islam does not give the equal weight to women. Indeed, they don't wish to acknowledge their equal value, and that is very often at the basis of many political disagreements between the outside world and Islam.
Well, certainly the politicised fundamentalist movements in the Islamic world overwhelmingly want to push women out of sight, and you don't see many women leading those movements. But it's also the case that most Muslims aren't actually at ease with those movements, and I've never been attracted to the fundamentalist wing of Islam, even though it's there and it's active and well populated. But for instance, just 2 weeks ago I was at the Vatican. We had this audience with Pope Benedict. The Catholic delegation, made up of clergy, by definition was all men, but there were several women in the Muslim delegation, including Ingrid Mattson, who's the head of the Islamic Society of North America. So it's not just the Islamic religion that has had difficulties in pushing women up to a position.
Perhaps it's all religions, I think to myself.
Well, that's probably the case. All traditional religions do assume that the place of women is in the domestic sphere, and that's something that, in my view, and on these social issues, I tend to take a rather soft rather than a fundamentalist view. I think that if women now have different aspirations, the religion really has to try and re-examine its inner mechanisms and find ways in which they can flourish.
Abdul Hakim, what effect did September the 11th have on you?
Well, it was disgusting, of course, as it was for everybody. I couldn't sleep for a long time. The realisation that a lot of other very bad things were likely to happen quite soon alarmed one, and also the sense of sort of pollution and dishonour that this thing had been done not just for some silly political ideology, but in the name of one's own religion, was kind of sickening. So that was atrocious. And then, of course, we had to orient ourselves and actually explain to the uncomprehending public opinion in the West that Islam is not a single thing and that that point of view is a lunatic fringe and we have nothing to do with it.
Did you feel any guilt at all?
I don't believe in that kind of guilt, but I do think that the Muslim leadership, and insofar as I engage with them myself, have the principal responsibility to engage with those people theologically and explain to them why they're wrong. We can't really allow the Pentagon to sort out an internal Muslim theological issue, because that's not going to work. And insofar as one is guilty, one feels that we haven't quite won that argument yet.
You haven't done that strongly enough, perhaps?
No, and part of the problem is that it's really political grievances that are behind it. They're saying, why should we respect the West at all if all they do is bomb us and take our oil and insult us, and why shouldn't we have a go at them?
There are also
It's hard.
there are many political issues around this which are closely knit with Islamic faith. For example, many Muslims tell me that they don't acknowledge the Declaration of Human Rights, and that democracy is not their choice, and would, as it were, those who champion democracy please back off, because they want to choose their own form of political organisation. Now, do you share that attitude to democracy?
Where democracy is brandished triumphantly by the West as the only possible political future for everybody, not just by Westerners, whether or not Afghan villagers want it, I think that that's counterproductive and outrageous. However, in the course of my travels, I find that the overwhelming majority of practicing Muslims in the West say that their countries are not democratic, not because of Islam, but because the West doesn't want them to democratize in case unsympathetic leaders come to the fore.
I can believe that, but do you yourself want to see democracy come to the fore, the best form of democracy?
Yeah, I take the view that the Muslim world is so internally diverse that a single template for the political life of all countries will not be forthcoming. There may be countries where the great majority of people actually don't want Western-style liberal democracy because they don't want the satellite dishes, the pornography, the lotto, whatever it is. I think that has to be respected. But overwhelmingly, I believe that representative government, representative democracy is not only what religious Muslims overwhelmingly want, but is the way out of the current dreadful situation where the West and the ruling elites are terrified of the public opinion. That can't go on forever. It's too horrible.
So where are we now? You have been part of these attempts to reconcile Islam and Christianity. The great demand by the Christian Church, as I understand it, is reciprocity, which is that they would like Christians to be treated with as much tolerance in Islamic countries as Muslims are treated here. Is that possible, likely?
Well, I hope that there would be more than reciprocity. Life for Muslims in Europe and America is a kind of hell at the moment. The way in which we're constantly insulted in the mass media, the way in which it's extraordinarily difficult to build mosques in just about any town in France that's controlled by the National Front, specific legislation against Muslim religion in Germany, prohibitions on conversion in many Orthodox countries, including Greece, the impossibility of getting permission to build mosques in most Orthodox countries. That's our reality. Europe is not some kind of enlightenment land of plenty and promise. If you're looking at it from underneath, from the perspective of asylum seekers, the weak, racially marginalised people, it's not actually terribly nice. Yes, I believe in religious freedom, and many Muslim countries have a long way to go, but I don't think that the West is necessarily the model people should be following. It's not a good situation here, and in many ways, with the rise of the far-right parties, it's becoming worse.
Nonetheless, if you live in Saudi Arabia, you can't celebrate Christmas. I mean, that feels pretty, restrictive.
I mean, in just about every other Muslim country you can, and the last time I was in Pakistan at Christmas, the municipality in Lahore had put up rather tired-looking Santas and Christmas trees all over the public thoroughfares. Saudi Arabia is a special case because of their theology, which is the Wahhabi theology, which is a particularly puritanical, uncompromising sort of Islam. But overwhelmingly in the Muslim world there are churches, and there are lots of new churches in the Gulf which I've visited, and the situation is not as bad as the media claim.
Well, we come back to Wahhabism, which is, although, as you say, a small and particular puritanical sect, and it has to be confronted as a really dangerous political movement. Where and how do you imagine that growing, developing, and being overwhelmed or muted into some tolerating faith?
Wahhabism, like any fundamentalism, I suppose, has its internal arguments. There is a radical wing within Wahhabism that takes the sort of puritanical absolutism that's the basic principle of their theology into the realm of the legal and the political, and it is, in a perhaps slightly aberrant form, the basic dynamo that guides Al-Qaeda, for instance. But nonetheless, one of the targets of Al-Qaeda is, of course, the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, which is also committed to Wahhabism. So sometimes we speak of Royal Saudi Wahhabism, which is generally politically quiet, and the Wahhabis of mass destruction.
And where do you stand? I mean, you lead prayers in the Cambridge Mosque, thoughtful people peacefully going around about their faith. Do you comment on these political issues in the broader world which are bringing such hostility towards Muslims?
People expect from a Friday sermon in the mosque that it won't be completely detached from the headlines or from their lives. It's also the case that there are certain rules for the preacher, and one of my teachers in the Middle East, an elderly Yemeni, said, when I said, what do I have to do because I really want to preach and stand up and have a big turban and sort of be admired, which was kind of what was in my heart, I must admit. He said, well, there's two basic rules. First, you have to love the congregation, otherwise you can't do it. Secondly, you mustn't focus on things that are the basis of a legitimate argument within the congregation. There are other contexts in Islam, and we're doing that all the time, but the Friday formal ceremony is a time for focusing on what actually holds people together, and I try as much as I can not to annoy people. Sometimes I fail.
Nonetheless, you feel, as you've expressed it, that the Islamic community is a subject of abuse and fear. What's your prediction for getting us all out of this mess?
What just about everybody wants is for the British Muslim community to be more integrated in a positive sense. The problem that one faces with a lot of young people is that they say, why should we integrate into a society that obviously hates us so much? They don't respect anything that is distinctive about Islam, so why should we? That's a good argument, and it's very hard.
Answer?
The answer is, never mind what they think about you, trust in God. Islam is a religion that wants its members to succeed, to be positive neighbours, to be part of the national endeavour. And whether or not people like you at the workplace, whether or not they bully you in the police or the armed forces, you just have to trust in God, and your faith in God, if it's real faith in God, should enable you to deal with any obstacles that might come your way.
Are you, as a convert, something of a bridge for them between these communities?
I'm not sure that I'm fully on the wavelength of many of the young people in our inner cities. Sometimes I go to Bradford, sometimes I go to Small Heath and Birmingham, Tower Hamlets, and talk to the young people. But I don't believe, if I'm honest, that I do it often enough really to be able to get under their skin and figure out exactly where the pain is.
Abdul Hakim, what is under your skin now? Has the journey been complete, and has it been fulfilling?
What is under my skin is the sense that you've won the battle, now you have to fight it. I think what it means is that you go through the door, and then the reality of religion is before you, which is ultimately about loving and adoring God, loving and adoring his creation, which is endlessly brilliant, beautiful, rigorous, difficult, fascinating, and trying to represent in one's own life a conformity to how God wants his servants to be. And that's difficult. Learning how to pray is easy, but actually conforming in the depths of one's being to what the divine, benign nature wants us to be, that's the real challenge, and I'm still working on that.
Abdul Hakim Murad, thank you very much.